Are you really following Jesus? I've been thinking about that a lot lately, especially in dealing with various other Christians and so-called modern Christian church, which, when Jesus spoke with the religious leaders of his day, he says, well, why do you put aside the commandments of God to keep your traditions? And Jesus said to any of his followers, well, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? Back then, the religious leaders of the day, the Jews, those that had come down from Israel, where God had given the 10 Commandments and the laws and the statutes and the judgments, and then you had the writings and the Psalms, or the Psalms and the writings. These were all supposed to govern how Israel, God's church in the wilderness, his people, were supposed to live and operate and worship God and treat one another. They had a nation, they had land, they had a priesthood. And then God took that all away because they weren't obeying him anyhow, He gave them these commandments by which they could live, live better than everybody else, and definitely be prosperous and honor God. And they didn't follow that. And then when Jesus Christ came into the world, he was like, he looked at these men and these religious leaders, and he says, you've got all your own rules, you've got all your own traditions, and you lay aside the commandments of God. So who are you? He was busy doing what God had sent him to do, and they were like, well, you're not following all of our rules. He's like, yeah, well, you lay aside the rules of God. You claim to be servants of God. And there were Pharisees and Sadducees, and today we've got this concept of what the Pharisee was, somebody who's a religious leader. It's become, an icon or a symbol. It's just a term. They're a Pharisee. They have a religious position, but they really don't do what the eternal, the gods said. And today we also have, the modern terminology of what a cult is. That's a group of people who have deviated from the original, stepped off, let's say. They've departed from the original teachings. So we have plenty of Christian cults today. They say they're following the doctrines of Jesus Christ, but they're really not. And you could be deceived. I mean, I was a part of that. And any of us can be deceived at any time, or oppressed, or just out of our senses. And you got to get back to the teachings of Jesus. That's what I've been trying to do. And run into all these religious leaders. Well, hey, we've got all these rules, and we got all this, and this, and you really ought to obey all of our rules to fit in with us. Even one of their most common ones, Rabbi Zacharias. You listen to the man, and some of the things he says is biblical. But then he said this one statement in one of his things. Well, if you're going to fit into a group, you got to follow their rules. Well, of course, you've got to first say that as long as they're following all the rules of Jesus Christ, then, like Paul said, when he was with a Jew, he was like a Jew. When he was with the poor, he was like a poor. When he was with the Gentile, he was like, you fit in, to a certain degree. You don't pop people's bubble. That's what Jesus taught. You don't pop their wineskin. You don't give offense. See, and Paul, he said, well, if people come and they don't consent to wholesome doctrine, even the teachings of Jesus, so everything Paul said didn't disagree with what Jesus said, or it wouldn't be the Holy Scriptures, right? It wouldn't be good instructions on how to follow God. And Peter, an apostle of the day, who also walked with Jesus and was personally taught by Jesus and was filled with the Holy Spirit. God specifically made him an apostle along with James and John and Thaddeus and Thomas and Bartholomew, all the other 12 original apostles, right? He looked at Peter's writings of the day and he says, oh, Paul writes things that are hard to understand, and unstable men twist that to their own destruction. So you always go back to the teachings of Jesus. I mean, if you don't understand Paul's, or if you're contradicting, if you're in that place where you're contradicting the scriptures, yeah, you might be a Pharisee or a Christian cultist if you're not doing what Jesus said, or if you're contradicting various parts of the scriptures, because they don't contradict. Jesus never contradicted himself. He didn't speak out of both sides of his mouth. That's what he said the religious leaders of the day did. They were actually very good at that. An example was when they brought that woman in adultery, right, to Jesus to say, here, well, how do you judge the matter? Okay, right there, just the opening setup. Jesus didn't even say anything. He just started writing in the ground, right? He was like, I mean, if you want to observe what was happening during that day, you've got to consider the rules that were around at that time. Now, these are the Pharisees. According to the law, this woman was caught in adultery. I mean, just their opening setup is like, yeah, but according to the law, you also bring her before a judge who's ever set up as the judge, or you bring her before the king of Israel, right? Well, that's only part of the law. The Jews knew what the law was. Yeah, you go back to Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. It says, if people are caught in adultery, it takes two, a man and a woman, you bring them both. Okay, so right there, they're saying, well, according to the law, Jesus didn't even say anything. We don't know what he wrote, but they knew what the law was, is you bring both of them. So immediately, the opening setup that these guys are doing is lawlessness. They are violating the law, and then they're wanting somebody to be judged by the law. That was what the religious leaders of that day did. And Jesus didn't even say a single word to them until he got done writing. Then he said, he who is without sin, any one of you who is not breaking the very law by which you're condemning these people, this woman, and that's even if the case is true, because you have to have 2 or 3 witnesses. So there's at least 2 or 3 of those so-called religious leaders, if they were the witnesses, that were also breaking the law. And if somebody brought her to them, and they're not applying the law, which is, where's the other person, then they're guilty also of executing false judgment. And why would they bring her to Jesus? Right? Because the law says you bring them to the priests, right? Or you bring them to the king. So why would they bring that woman to Jesus? Are they acknowledging who he was? Or are they breaking the law by having someone who's not capable of judging the law? You see how you quickly get into, we've got sin, we've got more sin, we've got the sin of not obeying the law that that you're supposedly enforcing. I mean, these guys were stinking rotten, and Jesus got around to calling them hypocrites. When you understand all of the context that goes on in that message, it's not about the woman. It really isn't. That's how stinking, rotten, lawless, and two-faced those religious leaders were. And they all turned and walked away, because part of the law says, if false witnesses arise, that's in Deuteronomy. That's part of the law. If a false witnesses arise, and they want someone to be judged a certain way, they say they committed this crime, and it's found to be false, well, you go ahead and do to them what they wanted done to the other person. That's part of the law. That's in the statutes and in the judgment. It's not in the Big Ten, right? It's like, so guess what? And even in our civil law, if you come into the legal system with a false accusation, you know, if you come wanting people to, and you're false, you know, the judge will turn on you. You can't bring a false case. Think about that. You can't be found in violation of the law. That's Rule 11 in the civil court. You know, if a lawyer comes in and he says all these things, he writes all these things, but they really are false, he's got so many days or he's going to come under the law himself. In fact, Herod came under the law. God struck him dead. Ate him up with worms. Some of the first high priests, not the high priest, Aaron was the first high priest, his sons, some of the first priests, they came in with incense and stuff. It wasn't wasn't what God wanted. It wasn't what God ordained. It wasn't what God says, hey, this is how you come before me, and this is the offering that you offer, and this is the incense that you offer. They just picked up whatever they wanted to and went before God and started waving stuff. And that was the God of the Old Testament. It was pretty harsh. But they knew they were breaking the rules. They just thought they could get away with it. And it doesn't matter if you're a priest. It doesn't matter if you're a judge. You know. Now, according to the scriptures, and we're talking about spiritual things. So the religious leaders of that day, I mean, they were stinking. It's not just that they didn't understand some of the stuff. I mean, a lot of what they did just stunk. Even according to their own rules, it stunk. That's why Pilate, when he saw these guys bring Jesus before him, they envy this guy. I mean, this is just competition. This is just one lawyer kicking another lawyer's butt. This is just one religious leader mad at another religious leader. It's just all male competition and jealousy and for envy, you know. This guy's got all these followers, people love him, you know. It'd be just like if one actor, you know, got another actor before a judge saying, you know, this guy is doing all these horrible things, and yeah, in reality, he's just sucking up more time. He's getting more followers. He's getting more business than you, you know. And Pilate knew it. Yeah, he knew. There's a reason he was Pilate. There was a reason he was in charge in Judea or Palestine, right? He's part of the Roman government. He knew how things shook out. Like Jesus said, the children of this generation are wiser than the children of light. I mean, you didn't get to be a governor in a territory like that without knowing how the ball bounced. He knew the rules. He knew the politics. He knew what men were. He wasn't fooled. Right? They're just pissed off at this guy. And so he played their little game, you know, because after all, they were religious leaders. They had a little bit of voice. There was political pressure that could be had there. He didn't want to revolt. He only had so many Roman soldiers. Didn't look good if your province rebelled against you, so there were political pressures. So he went through all the games. He knew we'll beat them up, we'll scourge them, maybe that'll make them happy, you know. And they're like, no, we want them dead, we want them dead. That was the religious leaders of the day. We want them dead, we want them dead. He's like, oh, well, don't want to revolt, what's one man, They come, they go. He tried to get them loose. Oh well. I know. I get to release one person at the feast. He's Pilate's busy. He's working the politics of the stuff, right? Well, who do you want? This guy that you're jealous of, or this notorious thief and killer? Oh, get rid of our competition. See, it was the religious leaders. Get rid of our competition. Or you're not a friend of Caesar's. It was all political pressure. Get rid of our competition, or we'll say you're not a friend of Caesar's. And we'll put political pressure on you because we can report things to Caesar. And he's like, oh, well, in that case, have the criminal. See? So the religious of the leaders of the day were no better than Caesar's puppets. Oh, wait, where do we see that today? Yeah, the religious leaders today, non-profit organizations, they're not speaking about how bad the government is, so they don't have to pay the taxes that Jesus Christ said that they should keep, that they should pay, right? They shouldn't keep. That's the religious leaders of the day. They're playing politics. They're in bed with the government. They're being a tax-exempt facility. They're not adding anything. They're not preserving, right? They're just being quiet about, oh yeah, we won't pay taxes. Oh great. Yeah, just don't say anything about how bad Caesar really is. Think about it. That's the religious system today. Most of the people who go to church, they don't understand a lot of that, because the religious leaders, they just keep knowledge from them and understanding and wisdom. That's why Jesus said, you're making disciples who are twice as bad as you are. Because the people at church don't even understand a lot of the truth that Jesus taught. Like about the woman caught in adultery. And Jesus looked at her and said, I don't condemn you. Just go and sin no more. If she was actually caught, it was like, well, yeah, adultery is sin, but just don't sin. I didn't come to condemn people. I came to save people. Yeah, so all these people that are going to these churches with all these religious leaders who are no better than the people who turned Jesus Christ over to Pilate. Yeah, he says to the people, well, yeah, this is idolatry. These religious leaders, they're not telling you the truth. They're not teaching about Jesus. You can catch them in their own hypocrisy if you know the Bible. Once you know the Word of God, and God, opens your eyes to that, well, then you can see these religious leaders are hypocritical. I mean, they're not following the teachings of Jesus. Jesus says, love one another as I have loved you. Don't go around in long robes. Love all these chief titles in the marketplace. Like rabbi. Don't be called rabbi. Don't be called master. Be a servant. Paul says, we preach Jesus as Lord, and we're just your servants. You ever been to a place where you've had a servant? Well, what would you like for food? What would you like to order? Right? I suppose there are some ministers like that. In this area of the country, I haven't seen very many of them, but I suppose they're out there someplace. Maybe they're out helping poor people, because that's what Jesus did. Binding up the wounded and all of that. And you really don't see them walking around in these great big structures with names and titles and stuff like that. Not paying their taxes. Sucking up people's offerings to God. And giving them very basic, if at all, messages. And the people might not understand. Because after all, once you're in that system, if you grow up in that system, you don't understand. Well, this and this, partly true and everything, and this and then you start reading the scriptures and you're like, wow. Yeah, for example, the religious leaders will, in mainstream anyhow. Well, actually, even in some of the non-mainstream. they'll have one person get up there and speak for a long time. And I've covered this already. But that's not what it says in 1 Corinthians 14. Let 2 or 3, let everybody give an offering. But you can catch them in their own stuff. Because they quote Paul and they say, yeah, Paul says don't allow women to teach men or to have authority over men. Oh yeah, and read 1 Corinthians 14. That says, yeah, have your women keep silent. You know, let them learn from their husbands at home. Been through this before. And then they'll go ahead and teach their other men's wives. It's like, yeah, okay. Do you care to read in Titus where it says, let the older women teach the younger women? Well, they don't make that possible either. In fact, then they have women get up and teach the whole congregation in some places, so they ignore the other part of Paul's writing. And it's like neither of them really fit. Why don't you just have the older women over here teaching the younger women? Why don't you have a place where everybody can come, or just have the men teach the men and have it interactive so that somebody can, you know, raise their hands like they do in the secular schools and say, hey, wait a minute, I don't see how that's right. I don't see how you're following the book. Well, well, no, you're not following the book. You're just not following the book. Jesus was allowed to be questioned. Yeah, go ahead. His disciples were questioned. And he gave an answer. Yeah, so question it. In fact, the Bible says, prove all things. Hold fast to that which is good. Jesus says, hey, if they don't sound like me, they're not using my voice, don't even listen to them. Yeah, most of the religions today, well, Christian religion. I can't speak about other people's religions because I don't read their book. I don't believe their systems. But I've heard some of them. And they usually try to be really consistent. I mean, a good scientist will be really consistent with the laws of nature. It's when you find the inconsistency with the laws of nature, or the laws of God for that matter. But a lot of modern churches, they just do away with the law. They keep their own traditions, so they don't have to worry about a common standard. A law that applies to everybody equally. Oh wait, we're finding that in the United States too. Where it started out with the laws of nature and of nature's God. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness given to you by the Creator. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal, and science supports that. Men are 99.9% equal. Doesn't matter their skin color. 99% equal on a cellular level. And women are 99.9% equal with women. And men and women are only like 99.5% different on a cellular level. Neanderthals was only 99.7%. So that's all within the range of, you know, Neanderthal is within the range of modern human, what we call modern humans, right? Those who have survived the extermination and the racism and the sexism and the elitism of history have made it into the modern times. You know, they've survived, maybe not because they were the fittest, just because they were the most brutal or the most well, they had the best things happen to them, right? You know, they were in the right place at the right time. Had the right skin color, whatever. But, you know, Neanderthals were pretty smart because there's a whole section of modern man that has got Neanderthal ancestors in it. So they could breed with modern human beings, so we've got to be the same. We got to be the same. Species in the same family will interbreed. Lions will breed with tigers. You know, there's a certain level of crossbreeding that happens within the same family of animal, you know, within the same species. You know, white-tailed deer will breed with black-tailed deer. You know, all the dogs will interbreed. Doesn't matter their size. They work it out. So Neanderthal was the same human as modern humans because they could interbreed. We were all in the 99 percentile. And if scientists come along and they have claimed data or some theory that disagrees with what's clearly scientific, well, then they're inconsistent. They're just like the religious leaders. It's a cult of science then, right? As you get a religious cult, you get cults in science too, because then people get wacky ideas that don't agree with what people know as what is really science. Today there's a lot of just plain consensus science. Well, we all agree that this is what it is. And somebody could come along with the raw data and say, well, wait a minute, this is what the raw data could say. Well, we all agree. Well, that doesn't make it science, that makes it a consensus. I mean, if you get down to the data, and even science says, or it's common, it used to be common, in God we trust, everybody else needs to bring data. And when you go through the scientific journals and you listen to the scientific magazines on the web, and I read them, some of them, there's all these papers that are getting retracted every year because people didn't do good science. Just like there's Christians who don't do good Bible study and follow the doctrines of Jesus. It's the same thing. You get a consensus going. And the consensus can get away from the actual data, the actual original teachings. Pretty scary, isn't it? If you get a cult of science. Just like you get a cult of Christianity, or you get a cult of anything, right? Scary stuff. And so imagine if you have the cult of science debating things with the cult of Christianity. You can guess, you start guessing at what the shadows mean, right? What does that shadow mean? What is that really an image of? Worse yet, you could be in the dark and not even see a shadow. And depending on how much light there is, what's that a shadow of? If there's even a shadow. Which, brings me to this other point. I work at a place, and this young guy says, it's not right. I'm like, what's not right? He goes, they're saying that's an electron microscope, and that's not right. I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, an electron microscope throws electrons at an object. You get this reflection back. And then because of the way it reflects, you can make an objective analysis of the data that comes back and say something about the image itself. That's an electron microscope. As opposed to a regular microscope, which is just throwing a light at it and then you see the actual image. Hopefully in color. But no, you can go black and white because you can learn something from the gray scale. That reveals a certain amount of information if it's just in the gray scale. And there are animals, all they know is the gray scale. They don't need color. They live and hunt in the gray scale. And they do it very well. Ask people who are colorblind. The gray scale works. The shadows, that are behind me, thrown off from the light that's there, or the shadows that show up because the light is over there. I mean, you can learn something from the shadows. You can learn something from the reflections. But if there's no light, there's no shadow. There's no reflections. So if you're in the dark, you got to go by a different sense. Hearing, smell, touch. Probably want to go by hearing and smell before you touch some things, though. Probably want to go by hearing before you get close enough to smell, because whatever you smell, that means particles of whatever it is have reached you. And if it's toxic, that toxic stuff has reached inside your nose or your mouth. which isn't too far from your brain, and it's going to go into your blood system. Hence the reason you don't want to breathe or smell some things. So if you can see it first, if there's light enough that you can see it, or if you're like a bat, you can put sound out there. You can sonar and you can get a reflection. You can get the light reflection, you can get the sound reflections, ultrasounds, radar, electron microscopes, X-rays. If you can throw something at it and get something back, you can learn something. Right? And so this person I was working with, they were upset because they're saying, it's like an electron microscope. Well, what are they doing? They're using a light bulb to pass something through an image, and they're just getting a shadow, and they're saying it's a reflection. And this young guy in his 20s, he knew the difference between a reflection and a shadow. He knew it wasn't right. And what are you doing telling children that? And what are the scientists busy doing, having a consensus, if it's not what the data actually says? They should actually say what the data says, right? Well, the data says that the Titanic has, the metal is a brittle hull. Yeah, but they didn't know, right? Because they were just doing what was normal, typical of the day, cutting costs, this and that. Even for its day, it had a brittle hull, right? Had they known that, had the captain the knowledge that, the metal that I have couldn't deal with this kind of impact, I should stop now.